History often hides its darkest chapters behind the grandeur of kings and the glory of empires. Yet, some stories demand to be told, not only to remember the past but to understand the choices that shape humanity. Today, we journey into one such chapter, the story of King Leopold I of Belgium, a ruler whose ambition and obsession with wealth transformed a vast African territory into his personal estate, leaving a trail of suffering that echoes to this day. Leopold I was no ordinary monarch. While many kings of his era pursued power within their own borders, Leopold set his sights on something far grander, a private empire in the heart of Africa. His desire was not merely to expand Belgium's influence but to amass personal wealth on an unprecedented scale. To him, the Congo was not a land of people with their own cultures, traditions, and lives. It was a treasure chest waiting to be opened, a vast resource to be exploited for his own gain. The story begins in the late 19th century, a time when European nations were racing to colonize Africa. The continent, rich in natural resources and largely unexplored by Europeans, became a playground for ambition and greed. Leopold, with his sharp intellect and polished charm, convinced the world that his mission was philanthropic. He claimed he would bring civilization, education, and religion to the Congolese people, but behind these noble words lay a far darker reality. His true aim was to control land, resources, and the lives of millions, all under the guise of a civilizing mission. To achieve his ambitions, Leopold used strategy, manipulation, and cunning diplomacy. He established organizations and sent explorers to negotiate treaties with local leaders, often presenting them as mutual agreements while effectively transferring control of their lands to the king. In 1885, he declared the creation of the Congo Free State, a massive territory at the heart of Africa, officially his personal domain rather than a colony of Belgium. This declaration marked the beginning of one of history's most infamous regimes, where the line between governance and personal ownership was brutally blurred. Under Leopold's rule, the Congo would experience forced labor, extreme punishment, and widespread exploitation. Millions of Congolese were compelled to work under unimaginable conditions, and those who failed to meet the impossible demands faced harsh consequences. Despite the suffering, reports of these atrocities were largely unknown outside the region for many years, hiding the human cost behind the veil of empire. As we explore this story, you will see how ambition, unchecked power, and the desire for personal wealth can lead to devastating consequences. You will also encounter the resilience and courage of the people who lived through this era, whose struggles and resistance remind us that even in the darkest times, humanity persists. If you are fascinated by history and want to uncover stories that reveal the complexities of our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. By doing, you join a community that values learning from the past to build a more informed and compassionate future. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an exploration into the hidden chapters of history, where truth is sometimes stranger and darker than fiction. Today, let us open the door to the Congo under King Leopold I, a story of ambition, power, and the human cost of empire. By the latter half of the 19th century, Europe was caught in a whirlwind of expansion and ambition, with nations racing to carve up the African continent in what would later be remembered as the Scramble for Africa. This period was not simply a contest of maps and flags. It was a contest of ideas, of influence, and, above all, of wealth. Each nation sought to claim territories that could feed its industries, fill its coffers, and elevate its standing on the global stage. In this climate of intense competition, the stage was perfectly set for those who saw opportunity not merely in serving a country, but in bending entire regions to the service of personal ambition. King Leopold of Belgium was such a man. a monarch whose keen intellect and persuasive charm allowed him to maneuver through this chaotic landscape and emerge with a prize few could imagine, a vast swath of Central Africa that he would claim as his private domain. Leopold did not act in isolation, nor did he announce his intentions bluntly. He operated with the finesse of a strategist, using the prevailing European belief in the civilizing mission as both shield and sword. The ideology of the time suggested that Africa was a continent in need of guidance, a place where European knowledge, religion, and governance could uplift its people. For Leopold, this rhetoric became the perfect pretext. He positioned himself as a benevolent guide, a custodian of progress, and a patron of science, education, and humanitarian work, all while masking a relentless drive to amass wealth. The creation of the International African Association provided a polished, philanthropic veneer for what would soon become one of the most exploitative regimes in history. And it was under this guise that he began assembling the mechanisms of control that would allow him to dominate the Congo with unprecedented authority. The exploration of the Congo was a critical step in turning ambition into reality, and Leopold's choice of Henry Morton Stanley as his agent exemplifies the calculated precision of his plan. Stanley, the famed explorer, was tasked with mapping the Congo River basin and establishing treaties with local leaders, ostensibly to facilitate trade and cooperation. Yet these treaties, often negotiated under duress or through misleading terms, effectively transferred the sovereignty of entire territories to Leopold. In doing, he transformed the map of Africa not with armies, but with pen and paper, turning diplomacy into a tool of personal empire. The larger European context amplified the ease with which he accomplished this. Nations eager to avoid conflict were quick to recognize his control, while public narratives celebrated exploration and humanitarian efforts, largely oblivious to the human cost that underpinned every document and treaty. As Leopold consolidated control, the Congo Free State emerged as a unique and unsettling entity, a vast territory not under the authority of a nation, but under the whims of a single monarch whose ambitions were boundless. The scramble for Africa provided the perfect backdrop for this audacious claim, as the eyes of the world were focused on colonial rivalry rather than on the realities of governance and justice within the lands being claimed. In this environment, Leopold's personal vision, part empire, part private fortune, was tolerated, even admired by some, because it aligned with the prevailing European narrative that framed colonial conquest as both inevitable and morally justified. He was able to cultivate the appearance of legitimacy, inviting explorers, scientists, and missionaries into the Congo while orchestrating systems of control that would extract its wealth and subjugate its people without meaningful oversight. The exploitation of the Congo under Leopold's rule was extensive, systematic, and devastating, but it was precisely the international context of the scramble for Africa that allowed such a regime to flourish for decades before serious scrutiny emerged. As European powers drew borders and established colonies across the continent, the Congo became a stage upon which the king could enact a grand experiment of extraction and domination, blending the language of progress with the mechanics of oppression. Rubber, ivory, and other natural resources became the currency of Leopold's ambition, and the local population, millions of men, women, and children, were caught in a cycle of forced labor, violence, and terror that served the ambitions of a king thousands of miles away. The brutality, although concealed behind euphemisms of civilizing work and scientific endeavor, was both comprehensive and meticulously organized, reflecting the chilling efficiency with which personal ambition can transform systems into instruments of suffering when unchecked by oversight or moral accountability. Yet, even within this landscape of exploitation, the stories of the Congolese people persisted, weaving resilience and resistance into the narrative of a continent being reshaped by foreign hands. Villagers, workers, and communities found ways to survive, to maintain cultural traditions, and to resist oppression, even as the mechanisms of the king's control sought to erase their autonomy. These acts of quiet defiance and survival would later provide the foundation for broader movements toward reform, independence, and justice, highlighting how human courage can endure even in the shadow of overwhelming power. The Europeans' scramble, while a pretext for exploitation, also inadvertently created a shared consciousness among the oppressed, linking local resistance with global advocacy and eventually fueling international campaigns to expose the atrocities committed under Leopold's rule. The story of the Congo under King Leopold I is inseparable from the larger story of 19th-century European expansion, for it illustrates how geopolitical ambitions, ideological justifications, and personal greed intersected to create a landscape of unparalleled suffering. It shows how the pretense of progress can be weaponized to conceal exploitation, and how a single individual's vision can alter the lives of millions. By understanding this historical context, the scramble, the treaties, the rhetoric of civilization, we gain insight not only into the horrors that unfolded but also into the mechanisms of power and persuasion that enabled them. Through this lens, the Congo becomes more than a historical footnote. It becomes a testament to the consequences of unchecked ambition and the enduring importance of vigilance, advocacy, and the courage to speak out against injustice. By 1885, after years of careful maneuvering, diplomacy, and exploration, King Leopold I had secured for himself a vast territory in Central Africa, which he declared the Congo Free State, a domain entirely under his personal ownership rather than an official colony of Belgium. This act was unprecedented. Never before had a single European monarch claimed sovereignty over such an expansive region as private property, with the power to govern, exploit, and profit from it as if it were an extension of his own wealth, rather than the lives of millions of people. To the outside world, the Congo Free State appeared as a philanthropic endeavor, a territory in need of development, guided by the king's so-called vision of civilization, science, and moral guidance. But behind this polished image lay the carefully concealed machinery of one man's ambition. Leopold's control over the Congo was meticulous and strategic, a combination of clever administration, manipulation of local leaders, and ruthless enforcement. By presenting himself as a benefactor, he invited explorers, missionaries, and scientists to the region, creating the illusion of a humanitarian mission. These visitors brought knowledge, reports, and sometimes admiration, which Leopold skillfully used to bolster his legitimacy in the eyes of European governments and the international community. Meanwhile, treaties signed by local chiefs, often under misleading circumstances or with coercion, transferred authority over vast territories to Leopold, giving him a legal pretext for governance while ensuring the indigenous population had no meaningful voice in the decisions affecting their own lands. The Congo Free State under Leopold was not merely a colonial enterprise. It was a personal project of extraction and control, carefully designed to funnel resources directly into the king's hands. Rubber, ivory, copper, and other valuable commodities became the lifeblood of this empire, with forced labor serving as the engine of production. Villagers were compelled to meet stringent quotas, and the mechanisms of coercion were as inventive as they were brutal. Soldiers, organized into the king's private army known as the Force Publique, enforced compliance with terrifying efficiency. They held families hostage, punished those who failed quotas, and instilled fear in every corner of the territory, ensuring that Leopold's authority remained absolute. The Congo was transformed into a state where human life was subordinated to the king's wealth, and where the veneer of progress masked a reality of suffering, deprivation, and death. Despite the cruelty, Leopold maintained a careful public image that obscured the horrors taking place under his rule. He cultivated relationships with influential figures in Belgium and abroad, portraying himself as a visionary leader bringing order, Christianity, and economic opportunity to an allegedly backward region. Reports of progress, infrastructure projects, and trade were highlighted, while the systematic oppression of the Congolese people remained hidden behind euphemisms. Bureaucratic language. The complexity of this duality, public benevolence versus private exploitation, allowed Leopold to consolidate his power for over 2 decades, drawing criticism only slowly as brave individuals began to expose the truth. The establishment of the Congo Free State as Leopold's private colony also had profound social and cultural consequences. Indigenous communities, long accustomed to their own governance and traditions, found themselves subjected to foreign authority that treated them as resources rather than citizens. Social structures were disrupted, customary practices were suppressed, and fear permeated daily life. Disease, starvation, and violence compounded the suffering, and the population of the Congo plummeted as mortality soared. Yet, even in this environment of despair, the Congolese people found ways to survive, to resist, and to maintain a sense of identity and community, laying the groundwork for future movements of resistance and independence. Leopold's assertion of personal ownership over the Congo also set a precedent in how colonial power could be exercised. Unlike other European colonies administered by governments with at least some oversight, the Congo Free State was beholden to the ambitions and moral compass of a single individual. The lack of institutional accountability meant that the policies implemented could prioritize profit and efficiency over human welfare without meaningful challenge. It was a laboratory of exploitation, demonstrating how unchecked authority, combined with the rhetoric of civilization, could be used to manipulate international opinion while inflicting catastrophic harm on a population. Even as Leopold amassed wealth and expanded his empire, cracks began to appear in the facade. Accounts from missionaries, travelers, and investigators began to leak details of widespread atrocities, forced labor, and systemic abuses. These revelations would later galvanize international outrage. But at the time, the Congo Free State's status as a personal colony allowed Leopold to resist intervention and maintain the operations that fueled his fortune. This dual reality, the public image of humanitarian oversight and the hidden reality of oppression, defined the Congo Free State and underscored the dangers inherent in consolidating absolute power in the hands of a single ruler. Ultimately, the establishment of the Congo Free State as a personal colony illustrates the intersection of ambition, manipulation, and exploitation, a story that transcends the specifics of geography and era. It shows how rhetoric, strategic diplomacy, and the appearance of benevolence can conceal systemic injustice, and how the concentration of authority without accountability can devastate millions of lives. Yet, it also highlights human resilience. Amidst fear and suffering, communities preserved their identity, resisted oppression in small and large ways, and maintained hope for a future in which their voices could finally be heard. The Congo Free State stands as a chilling reminder of the costs of unchecked ambition, and the enduring strength of those who endure and resist. Under the shadow of King Leopold's immense ambition, the Congo became a landscape of relentless toil, where the extraction of natural wealth was the primary objective, and human life was treated as expendable. The vast forests and rivers, which had sustained generations of Congolese communities, were transformed into sites of intense exploitation, where millions were compelled to harvest rubber, collect ivory, mine copper, and dig for diamonds under conditions so severe that survival itself was uncertain. Leopold's administration. operating through the force publique, implemented a system that left no room for mercy or error. Every village was assigned quotas that were both unrealistic and unforgiving, and failure to meet them resulted in punishments that could include mutilation, imprisonment, or even death. Families were torn apart. Communities destabilized, and the social fabric that had connected generations was systematically eroded, all to serve the insatiable demands of a monarch thousands of miles away who saw these resources as extensions of his personal wealth. The rubber trade, in particular, became synonymous with the suffering inflicted under Leopold's regime, as global demand for rubber surged with the advent of industrialization. The Congo's natural rubber became a commodity of extraordinary value. Villagers were required to collect vast quantities from wild vines deep within dense forests, often traveling for days through dangerous terrain, facing wild animals, disease, and the constant threat of violent retribution. The rubber, once harvested, had to be transported across long distances to collection points, a journey that could claim the lives of those already weakened by starvation and overwork. The soldiers enforcing these quotas were infamous for their cruelty. They would take hostages, burn homes, and in some cases, amputate the hands of those deemed insufficient in their output, creating a climate of fear that extended far beyond the fields and forests. The Congolese, in the midst of this torment, were forced to navigate not only the physical challenges of their labor, but the psychological terror imposed by an authority that had dehumanized them in pursuit of profit. Ivory, another highly prized commodity, brought its own set of horrors. Elephants, which had long been integral to the ecosystems of the Congo, became targets for mass slaughter. Hunting parties, often organized under coercion or as part of military expeditions, decimated populations of these majestic creatures. The Congolese were pressed into service as hunters, porters, and laborers, frequently enduring injuries, exposure, and exhaustion in the process. The ivory collected was funneled into Leopold's growing empire of wealth, but the human and ecological toll was immense, further illustrating the depth of exploitation that underpinned the so-called civilizing mission. Copper and diamond mining similarly demanded extraordinary effort and resilience from the Congolese population. These resources, essential for European industries and global trade, were extracted under primitive conditions with minimal tools, forcing men, women, and even children into labor that was both physically taxing and perilous. Mine shafts were treacherous, prone to collapse and disease, and the constant exposure to harsh environments weakened the workers, making them more vulnerable to illness and injury. The wealth generated from these endeavors enriched Leopold personally, while the Congolese suffered in silence, their toil invisible to the wider world that remained captivated by tales of exploration, progress, and civilization. Yet, despite the systematic brutality, the Congolese people exhibited resilience and adaptability in the face of overwhelming adversity. Communities developed strategies to survive, whether through subtle forms of resistance, evasion, or clandestine cooperation, preserving cultural knowledge and social bonds even under the strain of forced labor. These acts, often small and invisible to the oppressors, were acts of defiance, a quiet assertion of humanity in an environment that sought to erase it. Oral histories, songs, and traditions passed down through generations carried the memory of suffering as well as courage, keeping alive the stories of endurance and resistance that would later inform broader movements for justice and liberation. The scale of exploitation under Leopold's personal rule was staggering, with mortality rates soaring as malnutrition, disease, and violent punishment claimed millions of lives. Yet the Congo Free State remained, for decades. A dark secret in plain sight, shielded by diplomatic maneuvering and the public narrative of a philanthropic mission. Missionaries, explorers, and traders occasionally documented what they witnessed, but their voices were often drowned out by propaganda and the prestige associated with the king's image in Europe. It was only through persistent reporting, advocacy, and the courage of individuals willing to speak truth to power that the full scope of the atrocities was gradually revealed. In reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that the extraction of rubber, ivory, copper, and diamonds was more than an economic endeavor. It was a demonstration of the devastating consequences when ambition, wealth, and power converge without accountability. The Congo under Leopold I was a world where survival and exploitation were inseparably intertwined, where human labor became a currency for personal enrichment, and where the natural world was reshaped to meet the insatiable desires of a single ruler. Yet it also serves as a testament to the endurance of the Congolese people, who, despite unimaginable hardships, preserved their dignity, their culture, and their hope. These narratives of exploitation and resilience are inseparable, reminding us that history is not only about the deeds of those in power, but about the lives of those who endure, resist, and ultimately reclaim their agency in the face of oppression. The Congo's story under Leopold I thus becomes both a warning and a lesson. The consequences of unchecked ambition and the human cost of resource-driven exploitation are profound. But even in the darkest circumstances, the courage, resilience, and determination of people can illuminate paths toward justice and remembrance, ensuring that the world does not forget the suffering that once occurred and the strength that emerged from it. In the Congo Free State, under the personal dominion of King Leopold I, the mechanisms of control were both precise and terrifying, designed to extract maximum wealth while leaving little room for humanity or mercy. Soldiers of the force publique, the king's private army, became instruments of absolute authority, carrying out orders with a combination of discipline and brutality that ensured compliance through fear. The population, already burdened by forced labor in the extraction of rubber, ivory, copper, and diamonds, faced the constant shadow of violence, which was used as a deliberate tool to enforce quotas and maintain the flow of resources to Leopold's coffers. These men were trained to impose terror in systematic ways, and the effects rippled through villages, forests, and riverbanks, instilling a pervasive sense of dread that permeated daily life. The enforcement of quotas was merciless, measured not by circumstance or effort, but by numbers that were often impossible to achieve. Villagers who failed to meet these quotas faced punishments so extreme that they have become emblematic of the horrors of Leopold's reign. Soldiers would mutilate, beat, and kill with a cold efficiency that reflected the single-minded focus on productivity and control. Families lived under the constant threat of witnessing loved ones suffer for perceived failures, and entire communities could be held collectively responsible, creating a social climate in which fear was as essential a tool of governance as any decree or policy. The act of cutting off hands, one of the most infamous methods of punishment, was not merely a symbolic gesture, but a terrifying demonstration of the lengths to which the administration would go to assert dominance, reminding all who lived in the Congo that personal failure or resistance could have irreversible consequences. This system of terror extended beyond the individual to the communal level, destabilizing traditional social structures and undermining local leadership. Chiefs and village elders, once custodians of culture and authority, found their influence subordinated to the demands of the king's agents, who often imposed arbitrary punishments and manipulated communities to ensure compliance. The resulting social fragmentation amplified the psychological impact of the forced labor system. As neighbors were pitted against each other, trust was eroded, and the communal cohesion that had sustained generations of Congolese life was systematically weakened. In this environment, survival required not only physical endurance but careful navigation of the threats imposed by those wielding the king's authority. Yet the cruelty of the force publique, while devastating, was not without limits imposed by human resilience. Stories persist of subtle forms of resistance: workers who sabotaged tools, villagers who concealed resources, and communities that devised signals or strategies to warn one another of impending inspections or violent incursions. These acts, though small in scale, represented defiance against a system designed to strip autonomy and crush spirit. They were expressions of agency in a world where choice was heavily constrained and courage became a form of survival, even under threat of severe punishment. These instances of resistance remind us that humanity persisted despite the oppressive conditions and that the Congolese people were far from passive victims. They were actors navigating an extraordinarily violent and coercive system. The violence imposed by Leopold's soldiers also intersected with disease, malnutrition, and environmental hazards, compounding the suffering and mortality among the population. Exhaustion from relentless labor, exposure to harsh conditions, and the constant psychological toll of fear left people vulnerable to illnesses that spread rapidly in overpopulated labor camps and villages disrupted by forced relocations. In such circumstances, the punishment for not meeting quotas was often indistinguishable from the natural consequences of the oppressive conditions. Yet the deliberate application of mutilation and execution added an element of terror that was both symbolic and functional, reinforcing compliance through fear and establishing a rigid hierarchy where the king's will was absolute. The system's sufficiency lay in its intertwining of economic objectives and social terror. Soldiers did not act out of individual malice alone. They operated within a carefully designed framework where brutality was institutionalized, codified, and normalized as part of the machinery of extraction. It was a world in which the value of life was measured against the demands of rubber and ivory quotas, and where the consequences of failing to meet expectations were public and punitive, serving as a warning to all who might hesitate or resist. The pervasive nature of fear ensured that even those who might have wished to oppose the system were often paralyzed, forced into complicity or silent suffering. Despite the pervasive climate of terror, it is essential to recognize the extraordinary resilience that emerged. Communities adapted, finding ways to preserve aspects of their cultural identity, transmit knowledge, and maintain solidarity in the face of oppression. Stories passed down through generations recount both suffering and survival, demonstrating that even in the most brutal circumstances, the human spirit persisted. This resilience would later serve as a foundation for advocacy, reform movements, and eventual resistance against colonial exploitation, showing that the imposition of terror, while effective in the short term, could never fully extinguish hope, memory, or courage. The story of soldiers enforcing quotas through violence, including the horrific act of mutilation, is a stark illustration of the human cost of unchecked power. It is a chapter in which ambition and greed converged with methodical cruelty, producing suffering on a massive scale. Yet it is also a chapter that reveals the endurance of those who were oppressed, whose lives and legacies remind us that even in the darkest moments of history, acts of courage, subtle resistance, and human resilience continue to shine, ensuring that such events are remembered not merely as tales of suffering, but as testaments to the strength of those who endured and survived. The human cost of King Leopold's personal dominion over the Congo Free State was catastrophic, a tragedy of unimaginable proportions that reshaped the demographic and social landscape of Central Africa. Before Leopold's arrival, the Congo was home to vibrant communities, cultures, and societies, numbering around 20 million people who had lived for generations in complex, interconnected systems of governance, trade, and tradition. By the end of Leopold's reign, estimates suggest that this population had been halved, with roughly 10 million men, women, and children having perished as a direct or indirect consequence of his policies. This staggering loss was not the result of natural calamity alone, but the combination of relentless forced labor, brutal violence, starvation, and disease, each element exacerbated by the others in a devastating feedback loop that left entire regions depopulated and communities shattered. The mechanisms by which this demographic catastrophe unfolded were as systematic as they were cruel. The Congolese people were compelled to extract rubber, ivory, copper, and diamonds to satisfy the demands of Leopold's growing empire of wealth, and failure to meet the impossible quotas was met with horrific punishment. Soldiers of the force public wielded violence as a tool of enforcement, beating, mutilating, and killing those who faltered, often in public displays intended to terrorize entire villages. Beyond this immediate brutality, the forced labor system disrupted agricultural production, resulting in widespread famine, while the dislocation of communities, combined with overcrowding and exhaustion, created fertile conditions for disease. Smallpox, sleeping sickness, and other epidemics swept through the population, magnifying the death toll and leaving survivors to grapple with the psychological trauma of witnessing friends and family succumb to preventable causes. These losses were not evenly distributed but cut across every stratum of Congolese society, from rural villages to urban centers, touching every age group and community. Families were often torn apart, with parents unable to protect their children, and young adults forced into labor for survival rather than cultural continuity or personal growth. Traditional social structures and leadership roles were undermined, as chiefs and elders who once guided their communities were subordinated to the whims of the king's agents, who enforced the extraction quotas without regard for local authority or custom. Religious, cultural, and communal practices were suppressed or disrupted entirely, erasing aspects of daily life that had sustained societies for generations. In this way, the population loss was not merely numerical but cultural, striking at the heart of Congolese identity and leaving an indelible mark on the social fabric. The scale of mortality also had profound psychological effects on the survivors. Living under constant threat of violence and witnessing the deaths of neighbors, friends, and family created a pervasive climate of fear and grief. Trauma became communal, shaping how people interacted, moved, and resisted within the confines of a system designed to dehumanize them. Stories passed down through generations speak not only of the physical hardships endured, but of the emotional and spiritual resilience required to survive under such oppressive conditions. The very act of enduring, of finding ways to maintain social bonds and cultural continuity, became a quiet form of resistance, preserving a sense of identity even in the shadow of overwhelming loss. Leopold's careful cultivation of his public image ensured that the full scale of this demographic catastrophe was obscured for decades. While explorers, missionaries, and journalists began documenting abuses, the king's narrative of philanthropy, civilization, and progress shielded him from immediate accountability. Reports of forced labor, mutilation, and starvation were often dismissed or minimized in Europe, where curiosity about the Congo was filtered through a lens of adventure and scientific exploration rather than the lived reality of its people. Only through the relentless advocacy of activists and investigators, who risked their reputations and safety to reveal the truth, did international awareness gradually rise, ultimately catalyzing reforms and the eventual end of Leopold's direct control in 1908. Even in the face of this staggering death toll, the Congolese people demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Villages reorganized to continue subsistence agriculture. Elders and cultural leaders found ways to pass down knowledge clandestinely. And communities maintained rituals and practices that affirmed their humanity despite relentless efforts to strip it away. This endurance underscores a fundamental truth. Even in the most catastrophic circumstances, human agency and cultural continuity can persist, providing the seeds for eventual recovery. Resistance and reclamation of autonomy. The demographic collapse under Leopold's reign, therefore, is not only a testament to the destructive power of unchecked ambition, but also to the remarkable strength of those who survived it. The halving of Congo's population during this period serves as a stark reminder of the consequences when personal greed and systemic violence converge unchecked. 10 million lives lost, countless families destroyed, and entire communities destabilized reflect the profound human toll of colonial exploitation. Yet they also illuminate the resilience that enabled survival and eventual liberation. This chapter of history, while horrifying, is critical for understanding not only the past, but the enduring legacies of injustice, and the importance of remembering and honoring the lives and courage of those who endured such oppression. By reflecting on these losses, we gain insight into both the devastating consequences of unrestrained power and the remarkable capacity for resilience, hope, and resistance that persists even in the darkest circumstances. As the Congo Free State plunged deeper into a cycle of forced labor, violence, and exploitation, the atrocities committed under King Leopold I's personal rule did not go entirely unnoticed, though the scope of suffering remained largely hidden from the broader world for years. Among the first to pierce through the carefully constructed facade of philanthropy and progress were investigators like Edmund Morel and Roger Casement, whose relentless dedication to uncovering the truth would ultimately expose the dark reality of the Congo and ignite global outrage. Morel, a British shipping clerk, initially noticed inconsistencies in the trade records of ships traveling between the Congo and Europe. Arriving in Liverpool, vessels laden with rubber and ivory returned empty-handed from the perspective of goods moving in the other direction, raising suspicions that the wealth arriving in Europe was being extracted at an extraordinary human cost. Motivated by curiosity and a profound sense of justice, Morel began investigating the operations in the Congo, gradually uncovering the horrifying reality of forced labor, systematic mutilation, and death that underpinned Leopold's personal empire. Morel's work quickly evolved from private curiosity into public advocacy. Recognizing the more imperative to act, he founded the Congo Reform Association, a pioneering effort to inform the European public and lobby governments for intervention. Through pamphlets, articles, and public lectures, Morel meticulously documented the mechanisms of exploitation. Villagers compelled to meet impossible quotas, soldiers wielding fear and violence as instruments of control, and entire communities devastated by famine, disease, and displacement. His efforts were not merely journalistic. They were an act of moral confrontation, challenging the narrative of benevolence that Leopold had carefully cultivated over decades. Morel's persistence highlighted the intersection of journalism, activism, and human rights, demonstrating how detailed evidence and strategic communication could galvanize public opinion and challenge entrenched systems of power. Roger Casement, an Irish diplomat and former British consul, brought an official and investigative lens to the atrocities. Pointed to assess conditions in the Congo, Casement traveled extensively throughout the region, meeting with villagers, local leaders, and missionaries to gather first-hand accounts of forced labor, mutilation, and widespread death. His reports, compiled with painstaking attention to detail, presented a stark contrast to the image of a civilized and orderly colony projected by Leopold. The Casement Report, as it came to be known, documented specific incidents of violence, including mutilation and execution, and traced the systemic nature of the exploitation back to the directives of the king's administration. By providing authoritative testimony grounded in direct observation and corroborated evidence, Casement transformed anecdotal reports of suffering into an irrefutable case that could not be ignored by governments, journalists, or the general public. The revelations brought forward by Morrill and Casement had a profound impact on international awareness and policy. European American audiences, previously fascinated by tales of exploration and the purported civilizing mission, were confronted with the stark truth: the Congo Free State was a personal enterprise of unprecedented cruelty, and millions of lives had been devastated in the pursuit of Leopold's wealth. Activists, intellectuals, and religious leaders joined the outcry, amplifying the findings of these investigators and placing sustained pressure on governments to respond. The moral authority of documented evidence, combined with public advocacy, created a powerful coalition that challenged the king's carefully managed image and forced the international community to reckon with the human cost of his private dominion. The courage of these investigators cannot be understated. Traveling through a territory marked by violence, disease, and logistical difficulty, they risked both personal safety and professional reputation to shine a light on abuses that the king had worked tirelessly to conceal. Morrill's meticulous tracking of trade patterns and Casement's direct fieldwork complemented each other, producing a comprehensive portrait of exploitation that left little room for denial. Their work not only exposed the mechanics of oppression but humanized the victims, giving voice to the Congolese people whose suffering had been largely invisible to the outside world. Villagers, once reduced to statistics and labor units, were portrayed as individuals with families, traditions, and intrinsic dignity, underscoring the ethical urgency of intervention. The global response, galvanized by these investigations, eventually pressured Leopold to relinquish personal control over the Congo in 1908, transferring administration to the Belgian government. While the transition did not immediately end suffering, it marked a turning point in international accountability, demonstrating that exposure, advocacy, and sustained moral pressure could influence the policies of even the most entrenched and powerful rulers. The legacy of Morrill and Casement also extended beyond the immediate political consequences, shaping early 20th century approaches to human rights advocacy. Investigative journalism and international oversight of colonial enterprises, their work remains a model for confronting systemic injustice through evidence-based exposure and moral persuasion, highlighting the capacity of individuals to challenge oppressive systems despite formidable obstacles. Even as their findings shocked the world, the human dimension of the Congo's plight remained central to the narrative they constructed. Each report, each public address, and each article emphasized not merely the statistics of death and destruction, but the lived experience of those who endured forced labor, mutilation, and displacement. The Congolese people were no longer invisible. They were witnesses, victims, and survivors whose stories compelled the international community to reckon with the moral implications of colonial exploitation. In connecting these accounts to broader human rights principles, Morrill and Casement transformed the Congo from a distant and abstract territory into a moral and political imperative, demanding recognition, reform, and justice. Ultimately, the work of Edmund Morrill and Roger Casement stands as a testament to the power of documentation, courage, and advocacy in the face of extreme oppression. By revealing the true nature of the Congo Free State, they illuminated the human cost of unchecked ambition and the importance of bearing witness to injustice, setting a precedent for future generations of investigators, journalists, and activists committed to confronting systemic abuse. Their legacy reminds us that even the most meticulously concealed atrocities can be exposed when evidence, moral conviction, and relentless persistence converge, and that global outrage, when informed by truth, can serve as a powerful catalyst for accountability, reform, and the pursuit of justice. In 1908, after decades of unimaginable suffering and international pressure catalyzed by the tireless work of investigators and activists, the Belgian government formally assumed control of the Congo Free State, bringing an official end to King Leopold I's personal dominion. Yet, while the transfer of power was hailed in Europe as a moral and administrative corrective, the reality on the ground remained grim, for colonial exploitation persisted under a different guise, perpetuating patterns of coercion, economic extraction, and social disruption that had long devastated the Congolese population. The transition did not equate to liberation. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in which bureaucratic governance replaced the arbitrary rule of a single monarch. Yet the structures of oppression and extraction remained firmly in place. The Belgian administration, inheriting both the wealth and infrastructure established under Leopold, continued to prioritize resource extraction, focusing on rubber, ivory, minerals, and other commodities, now formalized within state-sanctioned economic policies that still subordinated local needs to foreign profit. Villages that had been decimated under the previous regime were not immediately restored, and families torn apart by forced labor, starvation, and disease continued to face systemic challenges that hindered recovery and perpetuated cycles of poverty and marginalization. Despite the international outrage that had forced Leopold to relinquish personal control, the Congolese people remained subject to policies that extracted wealth with little concern for human cost, though now justified through colonial rhetoric of development, civilization, and progress. The bureaucratic machinery of governance, staffed by European administrators and enforced by local intermediaries, imposed quotas, regulated labor, and monitored compliance, echoing the same patterns of coercion that had characterized the king's rule. While overt atrocities such as mutilation or public executions may have decreased in frequency, the subtle mechanisms of control, forced labor, inadequate compensation, and systematic disruption of local economies continued to exact a profound toll. Communities were compelled to produce for export-oriented enterprises, often under harsh supervision, and the social structures that had historically allowed Congolese society to govern itself and maintain stability were subordinated to the imperatives of colonial administration. Education, health, and cultural institutions, which might have supported social recovery, were minimal or designed primarily to serve the administrative goals of the state. Missionary efforts introduced religious instruction and literacy, but often as instruments for social control and cultural assimilation, rather than genuine empowerment, shaping the worldview of younger generations to fit colonial expectations. Economic policies focused on maximizing profits for European stakeholders, and infrastructure projects, such as railways and ports, were constructed to facilitate resource extraction rather than enhance the well-being of local populations. Disease and malnutrition, compounded by years of demographic collapse and ecological disruption, continued to plague communities, limiting their ability to rebuild and leaving long-term scars on the population that persisted for decades. The persistence of exploitation after 1908 demonstrates the deep entrenchment of colonial systems that extended beyond the personality of a single tyrant. Leopold's reign had established a template of economic extraction reinforced by social terror, and while the explicit violence of his personal rule may have been curtailed, the essential structures that allowed for profit-driven oppression remained firmly in place. Rubber plantations, mining operations, and ivory collection continued to operate under colonial oversight, now legitimized by laws, regulations, and administrative procedures that masked coercion under the guise of legality. Local laborers were often coerced through taxation policies, compulsory recruitment, or restrictive contracts, which, while less overtly brutal than previous enforcement methods, still impose severe constraints on personal freedom, mobility, and opportunity. Yet even under continued colonial exploitation, the Congolese people demonstrated remarkable resilience, navigating the new administrative structures while preserving cultural practices. Knowledge, communalities, families and communities adapted to survive, finding ways to resist subtly through evasion, negotiation, or clandestine cooperation. Religious and political movements emerged, building upon both indigenous traditions and new forms of organization inspired by missionary and activist networks. Figures such as Simon Kimbang, who founded the Kimbanguist Church in the early 20th century, embodied this resilience, preaching spiritual and social autonomy while challenging the legitimacy of oppressive structures, even at the risk of imprisonment and persecution. Similarly, activists who would later spearhead independence movements drew on the collective memory of suffering and survival, transforming historical experience into political consciousness that demanded change. The continuation of exploitation under Belgian administration also served as a harsh lesson about the limitations of international oversight when confronted with systemic economic and political incentives. While Leopold's personal abuses had catalyzed outrage and reform, the deeper structures of colonial capitalism and state authority were far more difficult to dismantle. Extractive practices persisted not merely because of individual malfeasance, but because of entrenched systems in which the economic interests of a distant European state were inseparable from the governance of Congolese territories. The population continued to bear the consequences of labor exploitation, ecological disruption, and social dislocation, yet the moral clarity provided by moral casement and others now served as a reference point for resistance and advocacy. Their earlier work had established that systematic documentation and exposure could influence public perception and policy, even if the immediate results did not fully eradicate oppression. This period after 1908 underscores the duality of historical transition. While the Congo Free State ceased to exist as the private property of a king, the underlying structures that had devastated populations remained embedded within colonial governance. Exploitation persisted, but so too did the seeds of resistance. Cultural preservation and political mobilization. Communities endured, finding ways to adapt and survive despite systemic constraints, and early activists began laying the groundwork for eventual independence, asserting that dignity, autonomy, and self-determination were rights that could not be permanently suppressed. The continuation of colonial extraction thus serves both as a cautionary tale about the persistence of structural oppression and as a testament to human resilience, demonstrating that even in the face of prolonged adversity, the pursuit of justice, autonomy, and community can survive and ultimately triumph over exploitation. In reflecting on the transition from Leopold's personal rule to Belgian colonial administration, it becomes clear that liberation is rarely instantaneous and that structural oppression often outlives individual tyrants. Yet, within these circumstances, the Congolese people's endurance, cultural preservation, and emerging political consciousness illuminate the possibility of change, emphasizing the importance of vigilance, advocacy, and collective action in challenging injustice, even when it is embedded within formal systems of power. This chapter of history, complex and often painful, reminds us that the struggle against exploitation is ongoing, requiring not only recognition of past atrocities but continuous commitment to justice, equity, and human dignity. The story of the Congo. From the dark years of King Leopold I's personal rule to the era of Belgian colonial administration, is inextricably linked to the remarkable resilience and courage of individuals who refused to accept oppression as inevitable. And among the most iconic figures in this long struggle were Simon Kimbangu and Patrice Lumumba, whose leadership, vision, and sacrifice would ultimately help steer the nation toward independence in 1960. Simon Kimbangu emerged in the early 20th century as a deeply spiritual and socially conscious figure, preaching not only religious teachings but also a message of empowerment, self-respect, and resistance against the forces of colonial subjugation. In a time when the Congolese people were systematically deprived of autonomy, subjected to forced labor, and treated as instruments of economic extraction rather than human beings, Kimbangu's voice resonated with communities desperate for hope and moral guidance, offering both spiritual solace and a vision of a society in which dignity and justice could prevail. Kimbangu's influence extended beyond the spiritual. It challenged the authority of colonial officials and questioned the legitimacy of an administration built on coercion and exploitation. His teachings emphasized the capacity of the Congolese people to govern themselves, maintain cultural integrity, and resist oppressive structures without resorting to violence, a revolutionary notion in a society long dominated by foreign control. However, the colonial authorities viewed him as a threat, recognizing that the moral and political empowerment he offered could inspire resistance that would undermine their dominance. In response, Kimbangu was arrested and imprisoned for decades, a symbolic act intended to silence dissent and intimidate those who might follow his example. Yet even in confinement, his ideas and influence continued to permeate communities, spreading through oral traditions, clandestine gatherings, and the enduring strength of faith. As the 20th century progressed, the struggle for Congolese autonomy evolved from spiritual and moral resistance into political activism, culminating in the leadership of Patrice Lumumba, a charismatic and determined nationalist whose vision of independence was inseparable from the principles of social justice and human dignity that earlier figures like Kimbangu had championed. Lumumba grew up amid the enduring effects of colonial exploitation, witnessing firsthand the social dislocation, economic deprivation, and cultural suppression that had persisted despite international awareness and partial reforms. He became a prominent advocate for the Congolese people, articulating a vision in which the nation could reclaim its sovereignty, harness its resources for the benefit of its own population, and participate in the global community as an equal rather than a colony. His rhetoric combined eloquence, moral urgency, and practical political strategy, capturing the imagination of citizens across the Congo and galvanizing a movement that would eventually achieve independence in 1960. The paths of Kimbangu and Lumumba, though separated by decades and differing approaches, converge in their shared commitment to resisting oppression and asserting the humanity of the Congolese people. Kimbangu's spiritual and ethical framework laid the groundwork for a collective consciousness that valued autonomy, resilience, and moral integrity, while Lumumba transformed these principles into organized political action, demanding structural change, national self-determination, and international recognition of the Congo's right to govern itself. The interplay between spiritual inspiration and political activism highlights a broader truth. The fight for freedom and justice is multidimensional, requiring not only courage and leadership but also the cultivation of hope, identity, and solidarity within communities that have endured long-standing oppression. Lumumba's rise to leadership was meteoric and emblematic of the broader decolonization movement sweeping Africa in the mid-20th century. He became the first prime minister of the independent Congo, embodying the aspirations of a people who had endured decades of brutality, forced labor, and systemic exploitation. Yet his tenure was tragically brief, as political instability, Cold War geopolitics, and internal divisions undermined his ability to implement his vision fully. Despite this, Lumumba's legacy endured, symbolizing the Congo's struggle for self-determination, the assertion of national identity, and the enduring refusal to accept external domination as inevitable. His speeches, writings, and political actions continue to inspire generations, illustrating the profound impact that courageous leadership, informed by moral conviction and historical consciousness, can have on the trajectory of a nation. The story of Kimbangu and Lumumba also underscores the interconnectedness of cultural, spiritual, and political forms of resistance in shaping the path to independence. The Congolese people drew on centuries of cultural knowledge, a communal solidarity, and collective memory to sustain their societies under the twin pressures of Leopold's tyranny and Belgian colonial administration. Figures like Kimbangu provided moral and spiritual frameworks that nurtured resilience, while Lumumba channeled that resilience into tangible political action, demonstrating that liberation is both an internal and external process. It requires the preservation of identity, the cultivation of agency, and the strategic mobilization of political and social power to challenge entrenched structures of oppression. By 1960, when the Congo formally achieved independence, the achievements of Kimbangu, Lumumba, and countless unnamed activists, community leaders, and ordinary citizens came to fruition. The new nation faced enormous challenges, including the legacies of demographic collapse, economic exploitation, and cultural disruption, yet the collective struggle of decades had laid a foundation of hope, empowerment, and political awareness. Independence was not merely the transfer of formal political authority. It represented the culmination of a protracted struggle for recognition, justice, and dignity, anchored in the courage and vision of those who had resisted oppression against overwhelming odds. In reflecting on the journey from Leopold's brutal rule to Belgian administration and finally to independence, the narratives of Simon Kimbangu and Patrice Lumumba illuminate the centrality of leadership, moral courage, and organized resistance in confronting systemic oppression. Their lives demonstrate that liberation is rarely the work of a single moment, but the result of sustained effort, resilience, and the strategic mobilization of hope, vision, and solidarity. The Congo's path to independence serves as both a cautionary tale about the enduring consequences of colonial exploitation and a testament to the enduring power of human agency, demonstrating that even under the most oppressive circumstances, the pursuit of justice, dignity, and self-determination can prevail when guided by principled leadership and collective resolve. As we draw this story to a close, it becomes strikingly clear that King Leopold's reign represents one of history's most profound contradictions. On one hand, his personal and national ambitions contributed to industrial and infrastructural development in Belgium, modernizing railways, expanding industry, and projecting an image of a progressive European state. On the other hand, these achievements were inseparably linked to unimaginable suffering, exploitation, and death in the Congo, where millions of lives were lost and entire communities were torn apart under a system designed for profit at any human cost. The stark juxtaposition of progress and atrocity challenges us to confront the complexities of colonial history, reminding us that advancement for some often came at the expense of the most vulnerable. It is a sobering lesson in the moral responsibility that accompanies power, and in the urgent necessity of examining history with both honesty and compassion, acknowledging not only the accomplishments, but also the human toll that accompanied them. Leopold's reign underscores the danger of unchecked ambition and the lengths to which systemic exploitation can be rationalized through rhetoric, ideology, or legal authority. While Belgium flourished industrially and politically during his era, the Congo endured horrors that are difficult to comprehend fully. Forced labor, mutilation, starvation, disease, and social disruption. These were not isolated incidents but rather elements of a sustained, systemic campaign of extraction and control, facilitated by armies, bureaucracies, and international complicity, which reveals how intertwined global economic and political structures were in sustaining colonial oppression. By confronting this history, we are reminded that progress in one sphere cannot justify or obscure suffering in another, and that ethical governance and accountability must be central considerations in all systems of power. At the same time, the story of the Congo teaches us the enduring power of resilience, courage, and collective resistance. Figures such as Simon Kimbang, who offered spiritual guidance and moral courage in the face of oppressive forces, and Patrice Lumumba, whose political vision ultimately helped secure the Congo's independence, exemplify the capacity of human beings to endure hardship, maintain dignity, and challenge systemic injustice. These individuals, alongside countless unnamed Congolese who survived, resisted, and rebuilt their communities, demonstrate that even in the darkest chapters of history, agency, hope, and courage persist. Their stories provide not only inspiration, but also an important counterbalance to narratives that focus solely on oppression, illustrating that human resilience can thrive even under prolonged adversity. By examining Leopold's legacy through both the lens of Belgium's industrial progress and the suffering inflicted on the Congolese, we confront the dualities of colonial history, achievement and atrocity, development and exploitation, ambition and ethical failure. This confrontation is not merely an academic exercise. It has profound contemporary relevance. The structures and consequences of colonialism have shaped modern political, economic, and social systems, both in Europe and Africa, and understanding this history is essential for informed dialogue about justice, reparations, and reconciliation today. It teaches us that history is not a distant abstraction, but a living framework that continues to influence identities, opportunities, and inequalities in the present, and that engaging honestly with the past is a necessary step toward creating a more just and equitable future. As we reflect on these events, we are also reminded of the role of advocacy, courage, and the dissemination of truth in challenging oppression. Investigators like Edmund Morel and Roger Casement demonstrated that exposing atrocities and mobilizing public awareness can create meaningful change, even when confronting entrenched power. Their work, alongside the persistent resistance of Congolese leaders and communities, emphasizes the importance of bearing witness, documenting injustices, and refusing to remain silent in the face of wrongdoing. This principle remains timeless, offering a lesson for anyone seeking to confront injustice in their own communities or across the world. Change begins with awareness, is amplified by action, and is sustained by collective resolve. Ultimately, the legacy of Leopold's rule and the Congo's journey toward independence illuminates broader truths about the human condition. It shows the extremes of ambition and cruelty, but also the power of courage, solidarity, and resilience. It reminds us that history is neither purely heroic nor purely tragic, but a tapestry of human choices, consequences, and responses, where the actions of the few can have immense effects on the many. Yet the collective will and moral clarity of ordinary people can challenge even the most oppressive systems. By studying, remembering, and sharing these stories, We honor both the victims of past atrocities and the heroes of resistance, ensuring that their experiences continue to inform, inspire, and guide future generations. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's darkest and most instructive chapters. If you found this exploration meaningful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to uncover and discuss stories that shape our understanding of the world. Your support allows us to bring history to life with depth, context, and insight. And now, as you reflect on these stories of resilience, courage, and the lessons of the past, I wish you a peaceful and restful night. Sleep well, knowing that awareness and understanding are steps toward a better future for all.